Thank you everybody for joining us today. Big round of thanks to our summer team, Vasella and Claire, who have been in charge of putting the handouts for this program together. And I believe the handouts will be sent again together with the recording after the program is complete. Louise, thank you very much for all the wonderful work you are doing. And most importantly, thank you, Marc Masurovsky, for joining us today for our second workshop of the year. So let's see what's on the menu. We are working through the answers we received from you, our participants. Unlike the webinars that we have, we actually invite you to keep your cameras on because we're hoping that after the introductory remarks, we will be able to have this workshop actually be more interactive and more hands-on. So you are welcome to have your questions and participate as much as possible through the chat, and after you raise a hand and you're called on. So what are we talking about today? We're talking about provenance research, and I'm very pleased to know that the subject has drawn in so many enthusiasts. We looked at the results of the questionnaire, and you might be surprised or not, but we have undergraduate students, graduate students, art history professors, both practicing and retired in the room today. We have lawyers who are aware how important provenance research is for at least art-related stories. And some of you have come with provenance research experience and you're looking for refreshers, and others have not done much provenance research and you're looking for, from start to finish, how this is done. We will try to deliver as much useful content as we can, and if you have questions afterwards, please stay in touch with us. On your screen right now, there's nobody in the room that is photographed, but this is a picture from the Maastricht Fair from 2016. And this was the only time I made my way to Maastricht, and I saw a painting on the wall that looked vaguely familiar. It was quite small, and I was trying to place it because I've never been to Maastricht before. It was from Richard Green Gallery, and the provenance that the label on the wall gave was super brief. There was nothing but the name of the artist and the name of the painting and the dimensions. So this work of art kind of sat in the forefront of my mind until there was an aha moment. Art fairs will resume. Auctions have resumed already. This is a view from Sotheby's sale from yesterday. Old Masters sale, they sold the work of art by Anthony van Dyck. Estimated value was over £1 million, but it went for £2.4 million. It has pretty long provenance according to the auction house. And if you read through it, this is just an excerpt. You can see that at some point, monuments men were in the provenance. I actually find it quite upsetting to see monuments men as part of provenance. I don't think they're owners, but it does indicate that something happened in 1945 for this group of art historians to be involved with handling of this work. You can see that it was sold in 1941 for sale to Hermann Goering, and then at some point it was restituted to the family from which it was looted. So the artwork, having been restituted, was sold free and clear of any claims. This is an upcoming sale on the 8th of July, which is today, so you can bid on it after we're done with the Provenance Research Training Workshop. Property of the heirs of Jacob Lierens. This is a still life. You can see that the auction house gives you the look from the painting from behind. You can see some labels. It's quite interesting. And the provenance, also long, and also involved, this provenance also has a line about restitution. It was restituted from museum in Utrecht in 2019, and then the heirs decided to sell it about 2 years after. Museums tend to be hit pretty hard as auction houses with questions because they try to do the right thing. They try to provide information to their visitors, members of the public, and then sometimes when there are red flags, museums don't really know whether they should do the right thing and keep the piece and fight for it, or do the right thing and give it back to the heirs. This is a story for both art historians and lawyers in the room. Van Zaher versus Northern Simon Museum of Art. There's a little timeline from 1500s to the fall of 2020, and you can see that the work was nationalized in 1918, sold at auction in Berlin in 1930s. It was looted, it was restituted to the wrong family, sold to a museum, a long lawsuit, more than 10 years followed. And last year, Ukraine said we want it back because it was improperly nationalized 100 years ago. So provenance research is a very important element of that particular story. And unfortunately for us, Supreme Court declined to hear this case, and Northern Simon Museum got to keep the diptych in their possession. Headlines every day are asking questions that are provenance research oriented and law oriented. And our guest today will speak about probably less law, because law should not play a big role in provenance research. It should be as clear and unencumbered by worldly concerns, perhaps. This is another example of a painting, minor, old master, but he lived for a very short time. He's not a very well-known artist. Goudreau, his painting disappeared from Ukraine during World War II, and then it surfaced in New York in a small auction house in 2013. A few years later, not a decade, it was restituted to a museum in Ukraine. Many of your questions were, what about antiquities? And provenance research for antiquities is sometimes harder to conduct, sometimes easier. There is a case involving a Cambodian sandstone sculpture that really was decided based on its provenance. And you can see in front of you, there's a pedestal of the work of art that was slated to be auctioned by Sotheby's. If this is not provenance research in its tracks, I think we probably will have a harder time to find anything as clear. So Center for Art Law has a piece of art in its possession. We received a gift. The owner said, I don't know what it is, but it might be a constable. It's not the constable he thought he was giving us as a gift. This work was done after Constable died, and the original is in the museum in London. So we did our provenance research, and we have this huge monster in our office in case anybody wants to actually conduct some scientific analysis on that work of art. Provenance research, private museums, public museums, all over the world, it's the subject that is fortunately occupying our minds, and hopefully we're moving in the right direction of answering questions. What are the objects we're looking at? Where did they come from? Who had them? When? Were they ever stolen? Were they ever restituted? There's a question about this beautiful painting that was reproduced on a cover of a French magazine back in 1903. But the question is, between then and now, who was in the possession of this piece? And is it possible to recreate its trajectory? Where do you look for provenance research? I say everywhere within reasons. There is a little survey on the bottom. You can see the responses we received. Some of you know about databases that are available. Some of you are not familiar with any of the databases we listed. When you go to a museum and you see a private collection as provenance, this is very frustrating, not very informative. So the question is, once the questions are answered, can we share that information with the rest of the world so provenance research need not be repeated over and over again? All right, so everywhere, where do we start? In the books, in databases? Which databases? One of the questions, actually a theme we heard from you is, what are the reliable sources and which sources are less so? Wikipedia, we don't know, Art Loss Registry, et cetera, et cetera. So our guest today, Marc Masurovsky, has been doing provenance research 24/7 for a few decades. He is, I would say, guru of this field, and I think he has developed a Masurovsky provenance research method. So Marc, would you please take over and run the workshop? Thank you.
Thanks, Irina. I don't think I'm a guru, but thank you for having me today. I just, before I kind of launch in, I just wanted to comment on a couple of the slides. The Netcher painting at Richard Green's is a classic example of how a painting listed on a database leads to a restitution, even though the way that it unraveled was not exactly the most elegant. So this painting actually was stolen in Brussels. It belonged to a Belgian Jewish family, Andries. They had emigrated to the United States. Mr. Andries died shortly after arrival. His wife lived until the early 60s, I think. And she basically, since they were childless, they donated everything to charities, which means that when the Netcher was recovered, it had to be sold because it was not an individual who was going to recover. It was a set of charities in New York. So the reason why I'm mentioning it is because we have it in this database called the Jeu de Paume database, erproject.org. And I think the label given to the painting by the Germans was HA9, HA standing for Andries, and then 9, I guess that was the 9th painting that they had inventoried. So this is a classic case where the database itself had sufficient amount of information to allow a restitution attorney somewhere to make the link between the painting in a database and a painting that was being exhibited in the museum in Wuppertal in Germany. And that is basically how the restitution began. So, and that's kind of a byproduct of these databases, especially the public ones. I can't really speak too much about the proprietary ones because by definition, you can't see them. And they are duly protected that way, and you have to pay money to conduct searches. So they're as good as they say that they are. And the most famous one is the Art Loss Register database, which I guess was the first of its kind, which was spawned off by IFAR, the International Foundation for Art Research, and back in the late 80s, I believe. So ALR can claim to be have seniority, but in terms of a public database, it fails on all registers because by definition, we just don't know the quality of the data. And we don't know how much ground that database covers when it comes to, for instance, cultural losses during the Nazi era, which is, it's a long time, 1933 to 1945. And we're not talking about 10,000 objects, we're talking about potentially millions of objects. So that's really the nub of the problem with regards to databases. And so I'm just going to sort of give you a quick rundown of, quote unquote, the history of these databases, so you understand that it's been more of a search for the Holy Grail than anything else. And all the products that exist so far, or, I'd say the equivalent of the fifth toe on the left hind foot of the elephant, because that should give you an order of magnitude of what the problem is in terms of documenting the cultural losses, at least those of the Nazi years. And then if you want to add any losses from any other period, then you're basically creating an exponential issue. So the looted art, actually the Commission for Looted Art in Europe was the first one that put out a database, or one of the first anyway. I think it was I'm not sure how genuine the effort was in terms of demonstrating the power of a digital tool to do research and to understand the origins of specific objects, not just paintings, but works on paper, sculptures, decorative objects, books, musical instruments, textiles, Judaica, Hebraica, you name it, and antiquities, of course. And so you're supposed to be able to find those types of objects in any given database. The thing about the lootedart.com database is that it hasn't really been updated. in a serious way. I think it's there to show that databases can exist, and that's about it. Since I would say the early 21st century, there's been a concerted effort to create these monsters of digital information, and the problem is really how comprehensive do you want these databases to be? What do you want them to focus on? Do you want them to be generic in terms of addressing all losses everywhere from 1933, 1945? Or do you want to focus them? So for instance, the one that I helped develop, which was the erproject.org, set out as a sort of pilot project for a comprehensive database project of all cultural losses from the Nazi years. So we decided to focus on Western Europe as a starter and to use as a subset of data the objects that were confiscated by the Einsatzstab Heichleiter Rosenberg, which is the Alfred Rosenberg's cultural plunder task force, which was basically it spread out all over occupied Europe, and it essentially followed German armies wherever. And they did basically their business, which was to essentially deprive all Jews of their property, and particularly their cultural property, but also their household goods. So the erproject.org is an example of a database which focuses uniquely and solely on archival documents, and that's really an important consideration. I mean, I know some of you asked questions about reliability, and I would say reliability is based on the sources that are used and the types of documents that are used to populate a database. And if the more you rely on archival information, I think the more comfortable you should be. But then after that, you have to worry about how the information is distilled and how it is transferred and how it's presented to you and how searchable the database is. And also whether the information was interpreted properly. So when you ask yourself all those questions, you basically have to react like a typical, well, I would hope a typical researcher, which is not to rely on a single a database as a source of information. Now, I'm presuming by talking about all this that you're still locked up at home and you haven't gone to an archive or a library yet. This is pandemic style research. And so if you want to sort of complement the ER project database, for instance, you can look at two other databases. One is LostArt.de, which is the official database of the German Ministry of Culture. And you have dhm.de, which is a database that was developed by the German Historical Institute in Germany. And LostArt.de basically is, I would describe as a very passive database. In other words, the people who manage it don't really create their own content. They basically rely on others to supply content to them. And the others are chiefly claimants' representatives or the claimants themselves to document their losses. So in terms of reliability, you can basically vouch for what you find on LostArt.de as long as the source of the information is reliable. And it's not to disparage the legal profession, but there are many lawyers in this field, in this sort of niche field, who kind of don't know their history and they don't really understand sometimes what they're reading. And there are instances in LostArt.de where there are objects that have been erroneously reported as unrecovered, and where if they had just checked the historical record, they would have seen that these objects were recovered. So you run into these kinds of problems. I think the highlight of LostArt.de was when it basically agreed to populate the part of the database with the so-called Gerlet hoard. And if anything, that exercise showed the pitfalls of trying to present archival documents online, which are under heavy public scrutiny, and where a government agency can actually be hypersensitive about how the information is presented. So in the Gerlet case, basically they invoked all sorts of shenanigans like the data privacy laws to basically mask the names and redact the names of either buyers or sellers. And so there's sort of silly things like this which compel you basically to go to the archive at some point and look at the original documents. Because one thing that you do discover is that anything that is redacted you'll find the unredacted version somewhere in an archive, and you will not have any problems getting access. So it's more being dependent on bureaucratic, um, what do we call them, quirks, where they get hypersensitive about certain types of data. So Lost RD is still a good place to go because it gives you a sort of a wider range of cultural losses. It does provide you provenance information wherever it is available, and it gives you a framework. The problem is that it doesn't really document the history of the object before the Nazi years, and that is something that people have complained about. But part of the research process is to basically find the information that's missing in this database. And the reason why I mentioned dhm.de is because it is sort of the, well, it's not exactly the mirror of the ER database, but it is essentially its logical continuation and extension, because it is a digitization of all the information relating to all the objects that were basically recovered by Allied forces, mostly in Germany, not so much in Austria, and that transited through the central collecting point in Munich, which was set up in the former Führerbau, where Hitler had some administrative offices. And
Mark,
for
this is the website?
yeah, but it's kind of tricky to get to the database. So the database itself is actually quite useful. The problem is that it was done in a rush. There were 40,000 cards, I believe, that were digitized, and a lot of typos. But if you get creative, you can basically make it work for you. And essentially, it has kind of a bare minimum of information. But the one thing that I found extremely useful with it is that the Americans at the Munich Central Collecting Point, who essentially put the, who filled out the cards, and then the German assistants as well, were very careful to write down what they saw on the backs, particularly of the paintings and the framed works on paper. So one crucial addition that I think that this database provides you is information from the backs. And that is really something that I think every single art historian, provenance research person, and anybody interested in doing research on the history of objects will tell you, is that you look at the back first and you find out exactly how much information is there, which hasn't been cleaned or totally erased, because that's where you find labels, markings, that give you a snapshot of where the object was at particular points in time. And even though it's not a complete provenance, it actually may help you fill out some noticeable gaps in the provenances. So in that regard, so just let me finish with the Netzer painting. It was basically stolen in Brussels, sent to Paris, and then from Paris it was basically shipped to points unknown, either in Switzerland or Germany. We don't exactly know how it ended up in Wuppertal, but it must have been through one of the art dealers that was close to Goering, because this was one of the Goering paintings. At least it's a typical painting that he would have wanted. And so that's why we suspect that he went either to somebody by the name of Van der Heijt, and Van der Heijt had estates in Switzerland. The Museum of Wuppertal is actually the old Van der Heijt Museum. So that seems to be the most likely connection of how the painting was ended up there. But the fact that Richard Green didn't publish a provenance shouldn't be surprised, because as far as people like Green are concerned, less is best. So
right, but he purchased it himself from Christie's in 2014.
I think so, yeah. He's the one who bought it at the sale, yeah,
right.
at the restitution sale. I wanted to go back a little bit to the paintings that you showed, the Van Dyck painting and the De Heem, because
Mark, hold on very quickly before we leave this entirely. The ERR database has sometimes photographs, and sometimes it has these cards.
Yes.
Who was responsible for marrying this information together, or bringing it all into ERR project?
Yours truly. The images that you see here come from the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz. And the paintings, the photos of the paintings, the cards themselves come from a microfilm set that is at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. And we essentially asked a firm to digitize the microfilm images so we can have sort of standalone JPEGs, and that we could then upload into the database, because we felt it was important for people to see the actual card, which is reflected digitally in the data set that we created. So we try to follow the format. And unfortunately, the ER database was, a pilot, and but as such, from a database standpoint, it has a tremendous amount of imperfections. So it relies on your creative genius to be able to sort of gather information quickly. Some of it is obvious, a lot of it is not so obvious, and not every data set is equal. There are many times when we had absolutely nothing except occasionally the name of the owner, a brief description of the object, and no clue as to how it was stolen, by whom, and if it was ever recovered. And in our case, and to sort of just belabor this point just a little bit more, we basically confronted three types of documents, three locations, from College Park, Maryland, outside of Washington, D.C., from Koblenz, and from Paris. The Paris records basically are the restitution records and the records of documents submitted by families and the victims themselves, and also the perpetrator files that are still available in Paris at the Archives de la Courneuve, which is the Foreign Affairs Ministry archives. And the idea was to basically take the records from the perpetrators, which basically were the Koblenz records, and also German captured records that we found in College Park, Maryland, and confront them with the French records in terms of the post-war. So see whether there was if you could have an easy match between what was stolen and what was claimed. And many times you see that there are a lot of discrepancies in the evidence. And one side effect of the database is to show and to explicit the differences and the contrasts in the way that information is presented to you through various sources, because you're the ones who have to make a determination as to how valid and credible the information is that you have on a particular object, because it could be that the information was portrayed erroneously by the perpetrators, which did happen a lot, and it was mischaracterized by the claimant, which happens a lot, and and investigators, like American investigators, and it happens a lot that they also mischaracterize what they found and what they were looking for. So your job is basically like a forensic doctor, a mix of doctor, a mix of detective, and bringing all this together is basic critical thinking, and not believing everything that you read, and essentially trying to confront every piece of evidence together. So that's
one of the problems that we are facing all the time is that the names of the works keep changing and the sizes of the works keep changing.
Right.
Sometimes the titles are given in one language and they're descriptive sometimes. So do you have any, is that where you're saying creative thinking and being a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, there are different schools of thought here, and people get very passionate about it. In the English-speaking world, people tend to think, well, why don't you just put the titles in English? Well, first of all, I don't work for an auction house and a museum, so I'm catering to a global audience, and also I tend to give deference to the original document. So if the original document is in French, I will do what I can to basically provide you with the information in French. And then if it requires translation, to provide a translation. Same thing with German, same thing with Dutch, same thing with whatever language. And so that is one particular approach in terms of how these digital tools are designed, is they try to reflect as accurately as possible the original document. So if you want to translate it, that's an added effort, but that's more of a sort of a gift to you as the user. But I think the function of these databases is to essentially present to you the content that you would find in an archive by yourself if you wanted to spend the time. And it makes it, the database basically makes archival research more efficient, and it gives you sort of a leg up in terms of what you really want to look for in the archive. So instead of starting from scratch, as the title of this workshop indicates, it actually gives you 2 or 3 steps, it puts you 2 or 3 steps ahead from where you might have been had you basically just been starting like a starry-eyed child, seeing something for the first time. And although we end up looking like starry-eyed children when we do research, and then we transform that into a confused look, and then we become extremely overwhelmed, and then it becomes frustrating until you find something that you really need, and that's where the research becomes more interesting. The reason why I wanted to bring up these two paintings that were recovered, quote unquote, by the MFA&A is the very problem that we have with these provenances. In other words, they don't really tell you anything about the how. In other words, where did the MFA&A investigators find these? Was it found in Bavaria? Did it go? I mean, we figured that perhaps it did because it went through the Munich Central Collecting Point, but from whom? From what depot? From what possessor at the time? Was that person the one who bought it earlier on after it was offered for sale? So these are all the kinds of questions that really are supposed to be answered by these provenance documents. And unlike what Irina suggested in terms of mentioning a recovery in a provenance, I think that's perfectly fine because the recovery is an event in and of itself. And this is maybe a different approach to writing of provenance, but the provenance should record the events that highlight the trajectory of these objects. So especially when they were bounced around legally, illegally during those fateful years, it's really important to try to get into the micro history of the object because it serves several purposes. Number one, it's education. A lot of people just don't understand how these objects can change hands so frequently and so illegally for so long. And the more detail that you provide, the better it will be for a general understanding of what this kind of theft is, what the mechanics of these thefts look like, and the types of people who are involved, and how easy it is for these objects to change hands and basically to cross borders. So that's what I felt about this particular provenance, and it's the same thing with the De Haim provenance. It doesn't really give you any indication as to how that object fell into American hands or British hands or French hands or whoever it is who found it. Because when you do get into the sort of that vernacular, it's actually quite fascinating. And that's why, that's another purpose that the DHMDE database serves, is that it does give you the previous location of the object, which means where it was found by the Americans. And occasionally they do provide investigative comments on the cards, which more often than not were not reflected in the database itself. So it's another tip that you really need to look at the documents that inspire the databases, because otherwise you'll have to rely on the honesty and integrity of the person who was transcribing the information to be faithful to the original documents. And particularly when you're dealing with handwritten documents, which is what we're talking about with the Munich cards most of the time, it does require an additional effort on the part of the person doing the transcription, which more often than not leads to some serious disasters in the transcription process. So just to give you an example, if you do a search on Monet, the artist, in the DHM database, well, you really have to spell his name 6 or 7 different ways, because otherwise you just pick up subsets of the information and not all of the data sets themselves. And this is really another problem with these databases, is the extent to which they've been properly proofread. I'm guilty as charged. The ER project database was kind of unwieldy, and one of these typical neglected stepchildren who is understaffed and underfinanced. But I'm not here to whine about it. I'm just simply saying that the amount of data is so overwhelming. I mean, we're talking about 40,000 data sets now in the ER database, which means that you're talking about, several 100,000 words that have been transcribed over time. But it's not just simply retyping, it's also data analysis. And that's really what characterizes a decent database from one that's just simply a dumpster of information. And
Mark, where do we go to find the actual database if it's online?
Well, you have to click on Sammlung, and then Sammlung.
Okay, I'm there.
What?
Okay, Sammlung, and then?
And then it should take you to some subsets. I could send you the link.
Is it here?
I don't know. They've redid their website. Let me just send you the link. Okay.
Okay, super. If you guys have questions about any of the databases or any of the terms that we're using, or if you would like to suggest that we'll look at a particular provenance information, the reason I keep coming back to the National Gallery of Art in Washington is because after restitution, after the Christie sale in 2014 and the Maastricht display in 2016, that's where the painting ended up. And NGA is pretty good about keeping information about provenance available. So you can see they actually, if you're looking for a model, for example, of how to draft provenance information, this is a potential model because each step is explained, from artists, which makes sense, to then the purchase in 1674. In this instance, information is unpacked for you. And I'm very grateful to see all of these elements explained. And here is a footnote number 6 explaining that what Marc mentioned, the Belgian industrialist had this work of art and where it went onwards to 1941, 42, etc.
I would like to suggest that if you're going to look for preferred provenance models, quote unquote, because since it is an unregulated, unlicensed environment, people do whatever they want, and institutions likewise in terms of how they present information. So I would suggest that the way that provenances are presented also at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston becomes that's also a good place. And also the Getty has done a good job with some of its provenances. The curator at Indianapolis also has done a fine job with some of the provenance information dealing with wartime losses. So, there's been, in that sense, there's been some major improvements since the late 90s. But again, it's a very uneven assessment, if you want, of where we are, because some institutions just frankly don't care. This likewise with auction houses, it really depends on the mood of the day and what they're dealing with in terms of objects. Sometimes they are quite thorough, and other times, as you know, they clearly are not. And in this case, they were fairly systematic, except they could have made that additional effort to try to provide information as to where and how the object was found. And I'm sorry to say, and this has nothing to do with today's topic, but to use the MFA&A, the Monuments Men, as a provenance tool, as the item, is a little disingenuous.
Is it potentially a marketing tool? Because
well, that's all it is. It's a marketing tool. It's designed to enhance its value, but I think what enhances the value is the restitution itself and the fact that it was stolen, blah, blah, blah. So, and auction houses have known this for quite some time. What I wanted to make sure that we understand clearly, it's not a question of wrapping things up, but it's sort of to place databases where they belong. I think this is something that clearly came out during the pandemic. I mean, the last time I set foot in an archive or library was back in February 2020. So that was a month before things shut down in the United States. And this is all about online research. And online research should not be confused with looking at databases. Looking at databases is just one component of that overlying issue thing called online research. We like to call it more fondly kitchen research or bedroom research, whatever it is. You basically don't leave the comfort of your home, or you essentially go to a cafe, put on your headphones, and do the research. So, for instance, sites like the Getty provenance site are those kinds of sites that actually do provide you with, that serve their function, which is to behave like a portal through which you can do this thing called provenance research. Because the provenance research does rely on databases, but it also relies more and more on the availability of digitally available documents and hopefully presented in a legible manner, which is not always the case. So you have a number of art institutes, research facilities that have now thrown tons of documents online. INHA in France, Paris is just one of them. the Central Institute in Munich is another one. So you know, the RKD in the Netherlands. So you have more and more facilities in terms of doing this kind of research. The problem is, and this is really what came out during the pandemic, while I was working on a major research project, is it's still really far from perfect, or uh, your ability to find information is really directly proportionate to your capacity to be curious and to be creative and to think outside the box, because frankly, that's really what's required. And there is a lot that's available, but it's not necessarily in the best of shape, and it's not necessarily the easiest thing to find. I have a strong warning about using public sites like Wiki, even though they're tempting because they're right there and they just slap things together. A lot of times they're not necessarily the most accurate. And occasionally they do sort of engage in revisionist history. So use the wiki discreetly. Like your history professors would have said, please don't cite them in anything that you write. But there are more and more sites that are specialized on specific aspects of art historical research. The problem is, for instance, the ground that's covered. The databases that I mentioned to you are frankly more focused on Western and Central European losses, and during a really narrow period of time. So we're talking about a 5 or 6 year period. If you throw into this mix the so-called VNA list, which was digitized by the Free University of Berlin, the Micah Hoffman, that'll give you an insight into those so-called degenerate works that were basically purged from German cultural institutions. But that's also one particular window, and these are public collections that were essentially were thrown into the private art market, at least whatever wasn't destroyed. So when you sort of map this patch quilt, you realize that, you know, these tools are really reflective of specific interests, and they don't yet address the whole issue of something comprehensive. Because if it was going to be comprehensive, then you would add the Belgian losses, because right now, whatever databases exist in Belgium, they're still not public. In Holland, you have the NK, the so-called NK paintings, the unknowns, which are available for research. Likewise, in France, the so-called MNRs are available for research and have been for quite some time. Italy, you would have really nothing. Czech Republic, you have some sites on some of these research institutions that have popped up around World War II issues. But the databases themselves, which date back, I think, to the early 21st century, are not exactly in the best shape. And they're definitely not comprehensive, even from the standpoint of Czech cultural losses. The Polish government has a database, which is actually quite good, even though it's basic, but at least it's chock full of images, and there are a lot of them. It was actually a useful database for a recovery that took place in Vienna, I think 3 years ago, for a bust of Diane by Houdon. And so it was so, you know, there is clearly a relationship between the databases, the public databases, and, you know, the occasional recoveries that ensue. And they, in that regard, they do serve as credible checkpoints and documentation, evidentiary documentation. But again, as long as the data themselves on that database are reflective of archival documents that are properly cited, because that's another thing. When you look at these databases, if there's no citation, you really have to shy away, or essentially just handle with tweezers, because you certainly don't want to develop an entire theory about the history of a particular object based on information that you can't back up, and that was not backed up on any kind of website that you found. So again, the reason to go to these databases and to do online research is a substitute to not going to an archive. But still, the best research that you can possibly do is in an archive. But of course, you have to have the time and the resources to do this, you know, because it's not in a day that you can do it. It's in weeks and months. And this is where the databases come in, because they save you the time. Our purpose to create the ER database was to make the research more efficient, but at the same time, you know, sort of shine the light on something that people really haven't focused on really much in the last 50 years. So it's been, so it's still very young as a
Mark,
phenomenon.
a couple of questions.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
No,
One,
it's fine. I'm happy to answer questions. Otherwise, I can
they're
blabber
not
all day.
they're not necessarily related. So let's do an easier one first.
Okay.
Question about data protection.
Right.
The information that is available in these databases. So you said they're private databases. For example, Art Loss Registry is privately owned. It's not available for researchers
Right.
to just dive in. And then our database, it's available to the best of its exactly. But what about privacy? What about information that is there? Are you
Good
concerned
point.
or?
Well, we were concerned when we created the ER database. It was before the EU went a little wild with data privacy restrictions. So we sort of slid into there. But the fact that the IP address is located in the United States minimizes the impact, but there is still a possibility that somebody in France or Germany could essentially say, wait a minute, we don't want our name to be there, and then basically ask us to remove the name. So it was a matter of discussion, but because the names came out of publicly available documents, we figured that at that point we were, pretty much protected. It's not like we were revealing anything confidential. Most of the information is wartime information. If there's post-war information, it's not from the 60s, 70s, 80s, or those are the dates that right now are contentious. But it is getting tighter and it's getting more and more difficult. Right now, I just finished an exercise with testing the feasibility of building a different kind of sort of art loss database. And one of the primary considerations that comes up all the time is data privacy and data protection. And the archives, I have to say, are a little bit more aggressive now than they used to be in terms of pushback and what kind of information can be made public, whether we can show certain kinds of documents, because it's really what it comes down to. You can extract the information, but you can't show the documents. So those policies have been in place for quite some time. But the issue remains that the document itself cannot be read on one of these sites unless you get specific permission. And the problem now, again, is the dates, the threshold dates keep on shifting, whether it's 50 years or 100 years or 75 years. And then I think, if I'm not mistaken, it varies depending on the content and the sensitivity or the perceived sensitivity of information from 80 years ago. So it's still out there, and some countries are worse than others, and likewise, some are fairly lenient. But I think as a general rule, the further east you go, the worse it gets. But even in countries like Germany and France, there are clearly efforts to restrict even more access to public online archival resources.
So you mentioned Getty resources. They tend to digitize a lot of materials that they acquire, but I believe they, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe there was an effort to allow information about sales from whom paintings were purchased, but not to whom they were sold. I think that was at least in connection with the Noodler archives. There was the entire package was digitized but redacted.
Yeah, well, if they redacted anything, it's recent, because when I first looked at the Noodler ledgers, I thought I was it's like walking into Alibaba's cave, because
right.
People have been waiting for decades to look at those ledgers. And Noodler's was really notorious for peddling looted art coming out of Europe, so, and even coming out of Latin America. So it's been something that people have been waiting for years. And I did check for some transactions, and they were there. Nothing was redacted. So if there was any effort at redacting it, it's recent. So, but
is it possible it's the Gurlitt ledgers? There were some
yeah,
ledgers
it's the
that were
Gurlitt ledgers that are redacted.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
There's a question here about Soviet losses.
And Armenian art and databases.
Well, I don't know of anything about Armenia, I'm sorry to say. Maybe some of the associations, Armenian associations, might actually have developed some tools, but they probably be, just like many things that we find even in our area, the work of devoted, zealous, committed people who basically invest their own resources to create some of these digital tools. And So it's going to require some poking around to find out, but I'm sure there's something out there because of the massive interest that there is in at least the cultural part of the Armenian genocide. The Soviet databases, there is lostart.ru. It's a really unwieldy website. And the funny thing about it actually is when you click on the English version, at least that was true last year, you get a slightly smaller version of the Russian site. So it is kind of intriguing when you look at it. There is the part that's fascinating is that there is a tremendous amount of material of Far Eastern origins, so Chinese, Japanese, Korean, textiles, ornamentals. So it's, you know, it's kind of a curious tool, but it's really weak on data. So it's mostly images with bare descriptions. And so just like anything else, you know, I say you have to use it just as one stopping point, depending on what you're looking for. But it is kind of illogical how, at least it seemed like it to me when I looked at it last. I'm not sure if there are any efforts on the Russian part to update this information. And there is also this database that exists of archival information in, I think in Kiev, if I'm not mistaken, because there's a tremendous amount of historical documents dealing with plunder in Western Europe that ended up in Kiev, you know, courtesy of the ERR. So those documents basically were captured by the Soviet forces. And it's only been in the last 15, 20 years that there have been efforts to digitize the documents, or at least to create indices. I've seen some of those documents. They're actually quite interesting. So they do inform greatly as to what was going on in Belgium during the war.
Mark,
Yeah.
there were two exhibitions in St. Petersburg of trophy art. So that
Yes.
theoretically
Yeah, that was
is a resource.
Yeah, those exhibits actually were a funny moment, so to speak. I mean, it wasn't funny for some people, but it was in terms of a typical sort of propaganda point that our Russian friends were trying to score. And the propaganda point was simple. It was just them thumbing their noses at us, saying that, you know, we got our stuff and you can't get it. So, but the serious part of this is that there were some Jewish families that actually recognized their works, but unfortunately, the road to recovery is paved with really very bad intentions when it comes to Moscow, Kiev, and Minsk, and even the Baltic states for that matter. It's not going to happen unless there's a political discussion, but that's a different topic. So as far as the database world, you know, it's there are a couple of proprietary databases, and again, sight unseen, you have to pay them to try to get information. The ones that exist, which are publicly available, are spotty in terms of what the ground they covered, but at least they cover some ground. And I'd say they're stronger on the Western European, Central European losses. There's very little that you get on Eastern Europe. I mean, they're just sort of these spotty moments, but in terms of private losses, this is where most of the information is lacking. You probably will find more information about state losses than you will find about private losses, because it's kind of easier to document losses suffered by government ministries and museums and cultural institutions. But the main obstacle that we have in creating any comprehensive database is the failure of the private art market to open up its archives. And so again, we have to rely on information that comes from governments and from generous collectors and dealers who actually want to share, or galleries that have made their records available. I'm thinking of the Pearls Gallery and the Zaliman Gallery, for instance, at the AAA archives, the Archives of American Art. Is that it? Yes. And those archives are absolutely phenomenal. And if you combine what you can find there with standard art databases like Mutual Art, ArtPrice, ArtNet, and others, you can actually find some interesting sort of crisscrossing moments of, you know, if you find an object that's listed in the Pearls Gallery, for instance, and then you're looking for it on Mutual Art or ArtNet, you might actually find it because those if those objects have recirculated in the last 20 or 30 years, you're more than likely to find something. So it's, again, it's a work of imagination. I mean, you really have to, you can't put limitations on yourself when you do this kind of research, and you have to allow yourself to ask really questions that you think are completely stupid, but they might actually be the ones that guide you in an unforeseen direction, which could yield some information. And I've been up those roads many, many, many times. And the thing is that you have to persevere because there are so many dead ends, there's so many false leads, and it's frightening. And especially with what Irina was alluding to with changed titles, changed attributions, and that affects mostly the old master world, but even the modern works are not immune from all that mischaracterization. The way that people measure objects, and if they're not specific about the fact whether they're measuring inside the frame or outside the frame, could mislead. And even when you work on World War II losses, and even those folks at the ER who are supposed to be such experts, since they come out of the museum world, they still get it wrong and they still mismeasure things. And that really complicates matters when you're involved in a restitution exercise, because the fact that you have 3 different measurements, 5 different titles for the same work might actually compel the current possessor to say, well, how can you be so sure that you have the same, that this is the same object? And this is why a reliable database actually does part of that analytical work for you and has at least made the additional effort to take cognizance of the fact that these objects have been mismeasured and to reflect the mismeasurements and bring them together for the same data set and not create separate data sets for it. And so there are all sorts of strategies that you really have to be very clear about when you present this kind of information, because it can have serious implications when, if and when a family wakes up and realizes that they can essentially try to recover this particular painting, this particular work on paper or sculpture or whatever. So it's a it's a data confrontation exercise more than anything.
I would like to invite our attendees to either raise hand and ask questions or put more questions into the chat. Well, in the meantime, there's this very small vignette. I apologize for it. There's a private database, which I find particularly outstanding. It's the Catalogue Raisonné of Paul Cézanne's works that have been digitized as a test, I think, for the usage of the underlying technology. Panopticon is the software that Paul Cézanne Catalogue Raisonné is resting upon, and everybody and anybody can make a private account and do a search by names in the provenance, by titles, etc. One of the works from the Gurlitt collection, which was, I believe, in the ERR database, as well as in the Cézanne Catalogue Raisonné. Here you see it as a black and white picture, because at the time when I took the screenshot, the work was labeled as present whereabouts unknown, and then subsequently the catalog was updated and information about Gurlitt's collection was put in. Marc, my question to you about the Gurlitt collection: what kind of lessons do you think, or what would provenance researchers expect to see in a collection of, let's say, 1,500 works of that ownership type? Where were you surprised to know that very few of the works in that collection were actually looted?
Yeah, that was totally shocking. Yeah, I have to admit I was really taken by surprise there. I honestly believe that there are more, especially on the painting side, there are more paintings that are potentially restitutable. It's just, and it's really not to poo-poo the work of the researchers. I think they did an incredible job, but they probably were hamstrung by resource issues, and knowing that Mr. Hildebrand Gurlitt was a frequent buyer on the French market required that most of the research be done in France, which I believe they had a team there, but they should have deployed many more resources, and because it was too important. So I had done some standard sort of random checks, especially of the paintings that came out of this so-called Salzburg hoard, which turned out to be the more interesting ones. And there were a number of potential hits, between those and the ER database. And I haven't seen them being promoted as restitutable works or anything. So I'm not quite sure what the game plan was. And I do understand also that works on paper are some of the worst ones, some of the most challenging to find, to basically walk back the chain of ownership, because especially when you're dealing with multiples like lithographs, etchings, prints of all sorts, you're not likely to find the right person unless the original owner wrote down somewhere the exact number of that particular print and set that they essentially acquired, so that if that one got stolen, if it was like 3 of 80, 5 of 20, and if it was a perfect match with the one that's currently in that little museum in Geneva, then fine, you have something to talk about. But again, you know, you're dealing with a lot of people who were owners because they liked art, and they weren't maniacal and wrote down everything about these pieces thinking that sometime somebody was going to steal it and then there'd be a possibility of recovering it. So this is really in the intrinsic problem underlying the degree to which you can find reliable, credible information about these objects, is that frankly, for the longest period of time, people really didn't keep records that we would consider to be good or decent records. I mean, the legendary Ambroise Vollard was notorious for writing things on scraps of paper involving, you know, major works of art. And what do you do with that? So, I mean, there are ledgers clearly, but every dealer and every collector is very different. Some are completely anal, and others who just, you know, they've got card indexes, and you know, maybe you lose a card, maybe you don't lose a card. So it's your research essentially is obviously held hostage by the quality and cohesiveness of what you're going to find out there, and then it's up to you to find all the missing pieces. But one thing I would like to advise you all is that when you do this kind of research, you may start with the art historical side of it, which makes perfect sense, but then you have to be prepared to leave it behind and to enter the archives, or whether they're digital or on-site, of government agencies, law enforcement, economic agencies, treasury departments, finance departments, foreign affairs departments, because you're dealing with a crime, and a crime that was investigated, and the recovery process involved yet other types of agencies, and getting an object from point A to point B requires yet another type of institution. And every time you think about the different steps that an object would have taken, that step generated paperwork and involved another entity, another institution, or another set of individuals. And that, if you don't think like that, you're not going to get your research done. So I'm sorry to be blunt about this, but after all these years, you know, there's a couple of things that you pick up along the way, and that's really one of them, is you have to sort of look at each object as its own universe, and it's populated with people, with organizations, companies, institutions, and things happen in particular places at particular times. So geography is your friend, history is your friend, but you have a lot of other little friends out there that you don't know anything about, who might actually have information for you. But you have to branch out when you do this kind of research.
So you start by looking at, if you have the object, right? It depends. The lawyers like to say, whenever you ask them a question, typically they say the answer is it depends. But your research starts either with an object that is maybe divorced of information. You just look at it and you have to turn it in your hands and start by analyzing what it is. Does it have any labels? Where did it come from? Et cetera, et cetera. But what if you're looking at a list of a family's collection that is documented? You just don't know where a particular object ended up. You go to auction houses? Do you go to the library to look at a catalog for a
Well, I
particular
think
artist?
my first instinct would be to look for probably the comprehensive literature about a specific artist, if it does exist. And then if that doesn't exist in the form of a catalogue raisonné or a series of retrospective exhibits, then you go into maybe looking for experts who have worked on these artists, and hopefully it's the same kind of period. But I've seen many of these lists where they're just the name of the artist and a tentative title. You don't even know if it's a painting or work on paper, for all you know, and it could be a sculpture too. So those are the kinds of things that you run into more often than not. And but even so, the catalogue raisonné itself is not exhaustive because, for instance, I'm thinking of Dali. There are, I think, 15 or 18 Dalis in the ER database, and I think about a third of them only are documented in the catalogue raisonnés. And I think one of the major problems for that is that Dali sold directly to these particular collectors who then were plundered. So there is absolutely no official record because whoever the official anointed art historians are for Dali didn't even come into contact with either that owner or the pieces that he actually owned, or the papers that Dali might have kept explaining that transaction, which probably was done on a handshake during an afternoon visit at his studio. So those are the, that's one of the pitfalls, is that something that's labeled exhaustive is not exhaustive. It's as good as the people who basically worked on it. And if they forgot something, then that thing doesn't exist officially unless you find it documented somewhere else. And that's why you have to go to a plurality of sources and never assume that what you're looking at is the be all and end all of research. And I'm thinking also of this catalog on Picasso. You mentioned the Cézanne one. Well, the online Picasso project is actually quite good. And in fact, I was able to compare the 100 or so Picassos listed as stolen in the ER database with his scholars' phenomenal online tool. And it's the same issue, is that there are a number of Picassos that aren't in there. So I basically told them, and that's it. So it's really based on what you as a mortal human being can collect and gather as far as information is concerned. And you might actually find things in rather unorthodox places. So
is there a way for databases to point at each other? Is there a website which lists all the databases?
Well, there are portals, but I don't think they point at each other. They're just sort of listings. The so-called International Research Portal, which was first designed by the National Archives in College Park, and I think is now with EHRI, EHRI, the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure. That website points you to the archives and to a select number of databases. So I think as a general rule, many of these major institutions like the Getty and others have on their quote unquote provenance websites a select listing of online tools. And, in that regard, some museums are better than other museums, some research institutions are better than others. But again, you're forced to go fish around in many different places because there might be some things that are not listed elsewhere. One thing I forgot to mention is Scipio. And I remember back in the early 2000s, I was introduced to Scipio by the curators at this charming little museum in Washington called the Hillwood. And I ended up being absolutely fascinated with it because I just sort of sat down there in front of this computer and picked up all these auctions. And it is quite good for that. And it was, learning something about the auction market is as much as valid a point of entry as it is to look for traces of exhibits. And it's basically bringing all these elements together that you can start building if you want your research, your own personal research infrastructure. So if you know that paintings by Zach were only exhibited 15 times, then that gives you 15 catalogs to look at instead of 100 or 200. So any point of entry for this kind of research that works for you is valid. Question is what you find on the other end. So
right. Niv, go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Mark. Hi, Irina. Mark, you were just talking about finding an artwork by an artist when you're coming from a list instead of holding the artwork in your hands. And I guess I wanted to say that the examples that you brought up were all of first-rate, well-known artists from people who have lists. And of course, what we know is that most of the artworks were not of this type, and most of the holders didn't have lists.
Correct.
So I know what's happened to me several times is that I started either with somebody who said we had a such and such at home, or even in the ERR list, or I shouldn't say ERR list, but in the Munich Depot cards, an artwork was listed as such and such an artist. And in both cases, it was just erroneous.
Right.
It was close. It was
Mhm.
close. But if I had continued assuming that, continued looking for artworks by that artist,
You were never found it. Yeah.
yep.
Yeah. And that is really one of the, it's a huge issue, actually, and I'm glad you brought it up because during the work that I did on the ER database, for instance, many of the artists have no so-called sort of art historical sugar daddies who wrote about them. And sorry for the expression, but I couldn't find anything else. In other words, there was nobody out there who, you know, working on a PhD or master's or is a connoisseur of art would have bothered to write something on these particular artists. And I'm thinking, you know, my pet peeve has always been how Jewish artists have been portrayed in the art historical canon. And a lot of times it's the answer is not at all, but thousands of their studios were ransacked, pillaged, and their works either destroyed or thrown on the market. So for those pieces, it's going to require a tremendous amount of detective work. And remember also that many of these works are not signed. So if they're not signed, you have to rely on somebody's keen eye to basically be able to recognize, to focus on when and by whom that piece would have been produced. And it's only as good, again, as the person who's looking at it. And this is where you have to sort of make your peace with it. And even though we should be able to document many losses, assuming that the proper amounts of money and other types of capital are brought together, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can actually identify the exact artist and the exact person to which that piece belonged. And I have gone through many inventories supplied by victims and their families. And, you know, it is really one of those problems. The family lives in one set of attributions, and then somebody comes in and says, no, that is not a Monet, that is not a Clouet, that is not this, it's something else. Well, that becomes important if you look for that something else in the market. So if you thought they had a Clouet painting, and it's not at all a Clouet painting, it's just some 16th century whatever, you're not going to find it. And we're back into this reattribution world, and we're back into this world of documentation and how imperfect it is. I mean, most of the artists I think that you find in the art database, you can't really find anything on them on this wonderful internet. And the internet, again, is as good as the people who, you know, who produce stuff and content and put it in there, and as good as Mr. and Mrs. Google wanting to digitize, you know, libraries. You have to digitize small archival repositories and libraries where you wouldn't normally go, because that's the only way that you can do this kind of research in the future. So if I had anything to say to anybody, is focus, get off the beaten path and go to the small archives, small bookstores, small libraries, and little research institutes where you will find some serious gems. But until that happens, we're again caught up in this logic of high-end pieces, well-documented pieces versus the rest of the world, which finds no advocate. And that's why 95% of the objects that were stolen were never recovered or restituted properly.
So one of the ideas that keep recurring is objects of certain age, if done by not well-known artists or were owned by families that never submitted any kind of lists, or the lists were very descriptive and incomplete, they are very difficult to identify. What about antiquities? How, what kind of research, provenance research, Mark, can you suggest for those who are trying to identify Cambodian or Greek or other objects that are much older?
Yeah, I think in some sense, and I don't want to step on archaeologists' toes here, but once the object itself gets displaced, I would suggest that you basically apply the same logic, the same research logic that you would when you're researching losses from the Nazi years. And the reason why I'm saying this is because you're dealing with a crime. So in the case of the antiquity, either it's the crime is the act of extraction, or the crime is the fact that once it was extracted, it was placed in some public or private collection, and then from there it was seized or stolen, whatever it is that happened. So in some sense, you have to start the research. Well, where do you start it? Well, I would say the time of extraction. And you have to figure out when it was dug up, when it was found, where it was found, and who found it, and if there's any kind of documentation produced by whoever was the responsible archaeologist at the time and the agency that was sponsoring him or her. And so in a certain sense, we sort of have to think about the same things. It's just that those objects tend to move a little bit differently, but they ultimately end up in the same locations, either in a private collection or in a public collection. So one way or another, from the destination point, the research is going to be the same. It's just a question of going back up all those years and all those decades. Is it really worth going back to 3000 BC? Maybe not, probably not, because you're not going to find much of anything. But you should be able to start piecing the story together from the time that the object was extracted from the ground, and even the type of object guides you more or less to the geographical area where the object would have been removed. Obviously, if there's no record of that, then it complicates your research, but somehow or another, you should be able to go backwards in the same way that you do with objects that disappeared during the Holocaust years. So as far as databases are concerned, cultural heritage sites, there are organizations that have developed their own tools. I'm thinking of Antiquities Coalition, ATAR, some of I think the red lists exist,
Right.
and there's Object ID that exists. So there are a number of listings, but again, I think even on the antiquity side, it's not great. We did see the huge potentialities in developing these databases after the sacking of the Baghdad Museum, because I've never seen so many people and so many quarreling agencies get together to create a database of what had been removed from the museum itself. So there's hope. Interpol has its database, but it also has its problems. And the way that you get things on the Interpol database is not totally obvious. And it requires a vetting process that makes getting a clearance look like child's play. So it's the tools exist, but I think on both sides, they're equally imperfect and definitely horrible in terms of tremendous lack of information for indigenous and items that have been removed from either First Nations, Native American lands, or indigenous communities around the world. I mean, I haven't seen anything out there, frankly.
Mark, in your opinion, so for authenticity purposes, when lawyers are called in to try and either prove or disprove, or there is this idea of the tripod. You do provenance research to figure out trajectory of the object and look at the documents and archives. You call upon a scientist to take a look and see if the marble is from a particular quarry, if the sand and the toes is can be dated or placed on the map. And then there's a connoisseur who is supposed to tell you if this is by the hand of or not. So physical analysis of the work of art, would you consider that part of provenance research, or physical analysis is it a hybrid?
I think it's required when there's in our little world, I rarely heard of physical examinations of objects subject to restitution, except when there was a really serious discussion amongst experts. And I remember this happened with this alleged Rembrandt, and it had to get tested to see whether the grain of the wood was consistent with the type of wood that Rembrandt used for some of his works. So that's the only time that I actually heard of this type of forensic exercise. But this is where appraisers are best friends, because they are, some of them are absolutely relentless in terms of their conditions under which they will authenticate a piece, and they, more than anybody else I know in terms of a professional, know how to smoke out a provenance, a fake through a provenance. And that's really one of the great assets of a provenance, and that's why it's key to have it well developed, is it will basically point out the forgery faster than you can say ouch, because there are certain things that should not be in a provenance, and anybody who knows that particular the particular period or the particular area, the particular circumstances of how some of these objects moved around. They can sense a total absence of logic in some provenance pieces. I mean, for instance, just a classic example was the forged provenances for the portrait of Wally, which obviously gained some notoriety after the seizure at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And it turns out that Mr. Leopold, bless his heart, from the Leopold Foundation in Vienna, had essentially invented a number of provenances for the piece. So the question is, had those provenances been published today, would one have smoked out his treachery faster? Or is it that the way that they were written back in the late 50s, the 50s and 60s, and even as late as 70s, the market was just not sufficiently aware of the context in which Sheila works traveled? Because, Sheila is a relatively new, recent taste in the global art market. And, we know how much his works are worth, but until the 60s and even the mid 60s, 70s, he was sort of he was an acquired taste, but a gradually expensive one. So, so you have to be, I think, everything can be part of it. I think, honestly, in terms of the work that we do, the so-called condition reports that you may find could be helpful in helping you understand a little bit more about the object, and particularly if you're dealing with the same one. And it all depends, again, on what kind of information you were able to collect. Like, for instance, if you're dealing with a sculpture and you found a document that indicates that there's a particular incision, on a certain part of the sculpture, which shouldn't be there, but it was an accident or whatever, that is a telling marking. That's a marking that basically is indelible until somebody goes out of his or her way to remove it. So it's that kind of information that can help you and that can compel sort of a physical examination if there's no other way of ascertaining whether this is the same object or not. So it has its place, just like anything else. But I think, honestly, it all comes down to how much information you have to start with. And
where do we allocate our resources? Do we allocate resources on creating a comprehensive database? And by we, who would be actually working on it? Or encouraging historians to go in and work on catalog resonance for secondary or lesser known artists?
Well, I think it's, I know you don't want to hear this, but it's all the above. So developing a comprehensive database, that's sort of the long-term goal, and definitely not there yet. But improving the way that we get information out is something that we can do pretty much right away. So I think it requires sort of an additional effort on all fronts, art historians, art experts producing catalog resonance monographs, those who are producing catalogs for galleries, museums, and auctions. They should really be a little bit more diligent and make an extra effort to show how important the provenance is that accompanies the object being sold, because, again, it takes two to tango here. The person buying is really buying the object. That person is not necessarily buying the story behind the object. But if you modify this environment to basically communicate to the potential buyer or even seller that the story is just as important and enhances the object in a way that you can't even imagine, because people are genuinely interested only if we make it available to them. And this is something I think that's kind of lost sometimes in museums and elsewhere, is their desire not to say certain things is actually not driven by evidence. That I think the public is always starving for information, and the people visiting museums will read what you provide them. At least not everybody, but many people will. And if you present the story of the object in a way that is not treating us like children who can't take certain kinds of information. Oh my God, it was stolen. Well, a lot of things get stolen. Oh, took forever to recover it. Well, that's fine, that happens. You have to be able to tell that story, because if you can't tell that story, then you're rewriting the story of these objects, and therefore you're engaging in rather crass revisionism. So I think there's a lot to do just on the educational side, which can basically help prepare the groundwork for this comprehensive database, because it gets people used to the idea that you need more detailed information and you have to do more research. And the more is available, and I think also their researchers owe it to themselves and to everybody else not to be so proprietary about what they find, and not feel threatened if they share some information, because frankly, there's nothing more annoying than going to an archive and knowing that 20 people have been there before you, but the only reason why you're there is because they haven't shared their information. So there's a tremendous amount of work in what you're suggesting, but it's some of it can be done now as opposed to 5 years from now.
So the question, you touched upon it, the purpose of provenance research. What I hear you say is sharing of information, education, that's one of the purposes. The reason why some of the auction houses, or why auction houses are presenting complete information or less complete, is not just educational. Plus, very often this information on provenance in the auction catalogs is not warranted. If there is an omission or if there is some kind of a false line, it's for information purposes only. You can't really hold them responsible for making an omission or making a false statement on the provenance. What are the purposes, other purposes, practical purposes for provenance research?
Well, it's aside from understanding what you're working with, I mean, from a purely intellectual standpoint, it's, curiosity won't kill you necessarily. And at least I like to know what I'm looking at, what I'm working with. And if I have the time, just to find out for myself. Otherwise, I hope somebody else will have done it. But it's, the reason why provenance research became such a hot potato ever since 1998, or roughly then, so for the last 23 years, is precisely because of the lack of documentation for objects that are whose stories were not too clear, sitting in private and public collections on both sides of the Atlantic. And so in a certain sense, provenance research was intertwined from the get-go with issues of restitution, with issues of ethics, due diligence, telling the truth, lying, presenting skewed versions of the stories behind objects. And then obviously, you know how people are, they instantly question, well, what lies behind that decision not to provide information. So I've seen the information that auction houses publish, and more often than not, they are a little bit lazy. I mean, I know that they do their homework and they don't have much time to research objects, but for the love of God, you can't take as gospel everything that the consignor tells you. And it's in the consignor's interest sometimes to basically tell you one story when in fact there's another story behind the object. So in your job at the auction house, obviously, to smoke that out. Now, you may not have all the tools in hand, but I've seen a lot of things in provenances published by auction houses which are flat wrong. And in fact, there seems to be a tinge of manipulation to send the wrong message or a different message about the object story. Because, for instance, if you have a provenance which is detailed but with no dates and no locations, is that helpful? It's only helpful if you're familiar with the names of these people. But then when you have the names of people who were victimized during the war, who are in the provenance, but there are no dates, again, in terms of when they might have come to possession of this particular object, well, what does that tell you? It frustrates you because you want to know whether their ownership was before or after 1945, or before or after, another key date. And if they're in Germany, did they have this piece before 1933 or after 1933? So there are all these considerations that go into the creation of these provenances by the auction houses and the galleries, and they have to be, they send really mixed messages. So again, every piece of information counts. So if you know it's Paris, put Paris down. But don't put, Europe. That is useless for anybody. The property of a distinguished European nobleman. Who cares?
I love that.
I mean, that person could be living in a zoo somewhere in Timbuktu and we wouldn't know it. So, and I'm not trying to be silly about these things, but frankly, there's a level of absurdity that seems to be accepted and that auction houses and even galleries present to us, as if we're not going to care.
An important Midwest collection. Marc, thank you very much. We I think we answered most of the questions presented. If there will be more questions, I'm happy to send them
That's fine.
onwards.
Yes.
I would leave you with one. It's what you said about tinge of manipulation. If you look at certain catalogs, for example, for Portrait of Wally story, there are certain names and dates that get reversed. And if you don't double check, you just accept information on its face, and
Right.
The story and the myth gets perpetuated. Thank you very much for joining us today and for telling us about the databases. If there are questions, again, I welcome them. Please send them in to the Center for Art Law. A lot of food for thought. Hopefully everybody has a project they're working on, or now a little bit more of a direction. It's fun. I have to say it is frustrating to be looking for information and not find it. But if you don't succeed at first, you might succeed, a few years later. So best of luck with your provenance research, everybody.
You have to wait for years, just.
Or a week later, I don't know.
But anyway, I am happy to answer questions by email if people still have some. So.
Thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you for having me.
Be well, have a good summer, and hopefully we'll get to the archives before
sooner than later. Yes,
the end of the year.
Thank you, everybody. We'll follow up with an email with the slides, the handout, a survey that I also put in the chat. Have a wonderful summer, and we hope that we'll see you again in the fall, in person or virtually.
Thank you very